HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dark Carnivals, Modern Horror and the Origins of American Empire by W. Scott Poole. Read by Enrique Mcgavin. Is there an imaginable America without enemies and without the story of their slaughter and our triumph? Tom Engelhardt, End of Victory Culture, Cold War America and the Disillusioning of a Generation. Boy, the next word that comes out of your mouth better be some brilliant fucking Mark Twain shit, 'cause it's definitely going to be chiseled on your tombstone. Otis B. Driftwood, The Devil's Rejects. Prologue. Carnival and Empire. Who will survive America? Sound and smells and manic lights draw us in. Maybe we will see something forbidden? The curtain desires a hand to open it. A skull, bathed in a nauseating red glow, invites us to take the haunted ride. But what happens if we go to the dark carnival and wander the grounds, while barkers call us to see their sideshows, and the faces around us turn ghastly in the sodium pale light? It seems a place of banal cruelties. The soda pop toss, the baseball throw, the shooting range are all rigged. The sideshows transform human beings into abominations for our pleasure, freaks conscripted to help us feel normal. The rides are assembled with haste and indifference, and anyone who wants a whirligig, or to take a plunge on the roller coaster, bets on bad odds. The clowns sweat through their face paint. They are trying so hard to make us do something, to make us laugh. We cringe, because they look like they're hurting one another in their perverse play, wielding giant hammers and what we hope are only plastic pistols, rigged to explode into a little flag. Bang! Their brutal campaign leaves us with the deep unease that we have been abused, but are unable to articulate how or why. The dark carnival incites and titillates. The sawdust of the carnival has dried up and blown away in the winds of modernity. State fairs are perhaps the closest we come anymore to the sights, the sounds, and the fetid smells of those strange, compelling spaces. Even in the age of colossal theme parks run by Warner Brothers, Disney, and Universal Studios, the carnival seems more enticing precisely because it is not a safe place. You might get hurt. You might see something you can't unsee. There lives, somewhere in our psyches, where it has crouched on its haunches since the earliest human experience, a yearning for the taboo and the terrible. Our dark carnivals are, then, a place to visit, an experience desired only because we can leave it behind. But in truth, we cannot. If you live in the United States, you are a denizen of the dark carnival. Horror is the lingua franca. Horror defined the American century. Horror provided the legitimacy, the justifications, and the bread and circuses of American empire. Yet over the last few decades, horror has attempted to shake us out of our sleep, to understand the kind of world we have made, to discover that something wicked isn't coming. It's already here. The United States briefly resisted the subtle temptations of monsters from the dark after the very real carnage of World War I, 1914 to 1918. Just as the once great powers of Europe began to recognize the influence the United States would now have in global affairs, their cultures produced unnerving tales of revivified corpses, hallucinatory fever dreams, and crime lords with hypnotic powers of manipulation. Americans watched slapstick comedies and westerns. One of the most popular films of 1919 starred Lon Chaney in The Miracle Man, a romantic drama. By the late 1920s, frightening fictions startled the American public, like a relentless, unexpected pounding on the door at 3 a.m. Master of makeup effects Lon Chaney, no longer connected to romance and uplifting drama, terrified audiences in The Phantom of the Opera, 1925, his cadaverous head unveiled in a moment that, to this day, makes the viewer feel they've been forced to hear a hideous secret about the world. Cheney's villains, deluded masterminds, vampires, and violent sadists, delivered a skittering chill up the collective spine of what was becoming the most powerful country on Earth. His extraordinary skill with makeup effects made him the master of mutilation, his criminals and creatures distorted by suffering, amputation, and scar tissue. Darkness came with unexpected speed, the light of the sun spelunking into a black pool of night. Bela Lugosi glided ominously through the opera of terror that was Dracula, 1931. The same year, British war veteran James Whale directed Frankenstein, presenting Mary Shelley's monster as a very literal embodiment of a conflict that the German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg called a corpse factory. For almost 20 years, America danced the monster mash for the World War II generation and their children, making the squared cranium of Frankenstein's monster and the lonely yet threatening howl of the Wolfman two of the most recognizable menaces of America's mass culture. Horror fictions clashed with the way much of America wanted to understand itself. The Great Depression had, ironically, plagued the decade that invented the term the American Dream. James Truslow Adams, a popular historian, coined the term in a 1931 book called The Epic of America, which asserted that the country offered opportunity for each according to ability or achievement, even as millions stood in bread lines and a quarter of Americans found themselves unemployed. A bewildering optimism among American opinion makers of the era seemed irrepressible. In 1941, Henry Robinson Luce, the powerful founder of both Time and Life magazines, crafted the term the American Century. In perhaps one of the most influential editorials in U.S. history, published 8 months before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Luce worried that in certain quarters a sickness had taken over American life, a sickness something like a geopolitical malaise. "We Americans," he wrote, "are unhappy. The future doesn't seem to hold anything for us except conflict, disruption, war." But did it have to be this way? Absolutely not, Luce insisted. He fervently believed the United States had a burden to carry for the world, what he referred to as a manifest duty. The phrase he chose consciously echoed the 19th century idea of manifest destiny, a quasi-religious notion popularized by politicians and the press that saw the United States as chosen to civilize, colonize, and exploit the continent of North America. Luce argued that the sad giant must now take on a new destiny. The country had grown up and must do something more than defend its geographical borders. American prestige had to be weaponized so that the world could be safe for what Luce considered the country's superior values. Those values had less to do with democracy than with capitalism, even if Luce chose not to put the matter so bluntly. It was time for the country to become an empire. Historians have used the idea of the American century, not in the spirit of Luce's cheerleading, but to describe the country's military and political dominance. It's been an elastic term, used to describe more than a simple chronology, and applied not only to the 20th century proper, but to the 100 years following the end of the Great War, the bloodiest, deadliest, and most frightening century in human history. The bloody wake left by the American ascent into empire has been legitimized by the notion of American exceptionalism. The idea has deep roots. In fact, the image of America as a nation with a special identity and destiny can be found among both the makers and observers of America's war for independence. It's only been in the last few years that some of the basic tenets of American exceptionalism have been questioned. As recently as 2010, a USA Today Gallup poll found that fully 80% of respondents believe the United States to be the greatest nation on Earth. 2/3 believe this gave the country a special mission to lead the globe, essentially Luce's claim about the country. But things have changed. Another USA Today poll in 2020, conducted just before the strangest 4th of July in many years, found only 32% of Americans willing to assert without qualification that the country was the greatest on Earth, while another 28% cautiously, one almost wants to say wistfully, suggested that their country might be one of the greatest. In perhaps a much more telling response, nearly 70% of respondents wearily told pollsters that the United States had fallen into decline, or was simply headed in the wrong direction. The dark side of American exceptionalism became a common phrase as we entered a new decade. But why has this gone on so long unaddressed? Defeat in the Vietnam War would seem to have summoned the death knell of the notion. It did not. Ronald Reagan won a presidential election with a weirdly jolly assertion of American greatness, given the tenor of the times. Other countries might cling to the stale past, Reagan beamed. But we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Today, grasping at the idea that the United States has a special destiny seems almost a kind of psychosis after the sacrifice of almost 7,000 American lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. The tomorrow the world might follow us into appears distinctly dystopian. Almost 20 concurrent years of U.S. intervention and the death, dismemberment, and mental trauma of American soldiers left the region in catastrophic decline. Meanwhile, there have been close to 1 million civilian deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq alone. But the lure of the myth remains powerful. As late as 2012, Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney criticized Barack Obama for holding a nuanced view of American exceptionalism. Romney bragged that he held his shoulders a little higher when he traveled abroad, since as an American he had a special gift. Then we began to get sick. Chinese officials in the province of Hubei first warned of a novel coronavirus that caused severe respiratory problems in December of 2019. By February of 2020, the Centers for Disease Control recorded 14 instances of the virus in the United States. In a February 25th news briefing, Dr. Nancy Messonnier of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Disease called for the cancellation of events and used the now familiar phrase, social distancing. "We are asking the American public to work with us to prepare," she said, in the expectation that this could be bad. 2 days later, President Donald Trump told a raucous rally in South Carolina that COVID-19 was a hoax and accused his enemies of politicizing the issue. Parsing the meaning of the 45th president's words offers an exercise in frustration. In the most sympathetic reading, Trump did not claim that the virus didn't exist, only that its effects had been overemphasized by a press in, to use his words, hysteria mode. Larry Kudlow, the president's chief economic advisor, insisted that the virus had been contained and posed no danger to the economy. "I don't think it's going to be an economic tragedy at all," Kudlow said. The virus has proven a human tragedy on a massive scale. At the time of writing, the national death toll totals nearly 800,000 people, more deaths than the United States suffered during World War I and II, and far higher than all combined American casualties in global wars since 1945. The number of new infections stands at more than 100,000 a day, nearly twice the numbers of the most serious hot zones of the spring of 2020. Most of the countries in the world have yet to even reach that number in total. My insides coil in dread when considering how these numbers appear as you listen to this book. One assumes it became worse. We thought we didn't have to worry about such things. The cheery outlook favored by American officials since the mid-20th century convinced the nation that infectious disease would have even less chance against the country than a foreign military incursion. In an era that celebrated scientists as key parts of a much-vaunted American military machine, Americans took solace in the idea that penicillin ended the terror of wasting plagues like the 1918 influenza pandemic. COVID-19 exposed the absurdity of claiming any kind of exceptionalism for a nation with basic social and economic weaknesses unknown in much of Europe, Japan, and East Asia. South Korea and Vietnam have so far led the world in containing the virus. President Trump appealed to South Korea for medical equipment, even while attempting to bully them into large cash payments to maintain American troops at their border. Taiwan sent the United States PPE equipment. In fact, to my own county in South Carolina, that currently has zip codes with some of the highest infection spikes in the country. The effect of the virus has baffled Americans convinced of their special destiny and special character, and forced many to face hard truths about American power. Economist Paul Krugman wrote in March of 2020 that the United States has long stood out as the land of denial and death. Even before the exponential spread of a novel coronavirus, the United States had one of the lowest life expectancy rates in the developed world. Though frequently called into question, the idea of the American century, the ideal of American exceptionalism, and the certainty that the United States is and has always been the greatest nation on earth, still remain deeply rooted in American politics. They echo in the desperate and angry snarls to make America great again, bleating that sounds more like the cries of an injured animal than the confidence of a society that understands its values and practices them. But it also appears in the self-satisfied instance that the United States is already great. Thank you very much. Whether greatness lost or preponderance of power maintained, the idea of the American century continues to thrive. Is there a lonely crossroad where the nightmares of horror and the American century meet? Of course, horror and politics may seem as unrelated as raincoats and ice cream. The night you watch a horror movie is not the night you settle in with a history book or catch up on current events. You order pizza with friends and huddle together for the whirligig ride that jitters and jolts you. Ruined faces appear at rainy windows. The tension builds as a door creaks slowly into a vacuum of silence that suddenly erupts with screams. The whole flick comes in at just under 90 minutes and features a paranormal force unleashed by inebriated Gen Zs playing with that wicked old Ouija board or some comparable occult gadget. Or maybe a knife-wielding automaton will victimize the same age group for being at the worst possible place at the worst possible time. It's escapist fun. You startle reflexively at the jump scares, something terribly suddenly filling the frame. Then you laugh at yourself and your friends, happy with your own terror. Someone makes jokes about being scared to go to bed that no one takes seriously. After all, no one takes horror seriously. Well, that's no longer quite true. Over the last decade, as Americans became more acquainted with the twisted nature of their alleged exceptionalism, a clutch of horror films have given audiences more to think about than the dumb fun of a scare flick. Ari Aster's Hereditary and Midsummer marshaled complicated anxieties related to family, relationships, and social class. Aster jokingly called Hereditary just a little family drama, when in fact it's a crucible that burns the very concept of middle-class America family life to cinders, leaving behind a taste of its ashes. Similarly, Aster called Midsummer a breakup movie. But if you know the grotesque denouement, that's like referring to Scorsese's 1976 Taxi Driver as a classic boy-meets-girl drama. Aster knows his films cut to the bone and leave us questioning everything we think we know about even the most intimate expectations we have for the American good life. Romance, success, money, home, and family. Aster tells a story of American dreams grounded in trauma that then becomes inestimably worse, descending into insane violence. Jordan Peele's Get Out addressed racism in a post-racial society that maintains vast economic inequality and allows murderous police action against black men and women. Peele's film can be funny, horrific, and obsessively watchable. But in the meantime, it's a devastating measure of white supremacy. A bleak miracle of a movie that addresses everything from the heritage of slavery to racist policing to the way social class informs a variety of racism just as brutal as you'd find in a lynch mob. Zadie Smith called the film a compendium of black fears about white folk, both in terms of cultural symbolism and historical legacy. In Peele's ability to bring his gift of comic reversals to horror, Get Out becomes a film that contains its own commentary by making audiences understand that African Americans look fearfully on everything from white women who date black men, to well-meaning conversations about Obama, to nostalgia for slavery, and of course, slavery itself. Peele's follow-up film, a complex tale of social class, race, and an unseen horror that undergirds all of American history, may be the most politically confrontational horror film ever made. As Sazine Kohler noted in a strenuous essay written during 2020's nationwide protest against racist policing, economic structures, and public symbolism, Peele's Us addresses the fundamental toxicity of whiteness, white privilege, and its intersection with all kinds of violence. In the wake of these films, a horror-sance of social relevance, a debate between fandom and a relatively small number of cultural critics, exploded across several social media platforms and resulted in a welter of dueling essays. Steve Rose set the cat among the pigeons first in his much-derided Guardian think piece, How Post-Horror Movies Are Taking Over Cinema. In it, he described the traditional horror film using former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's infamously obtuse phrase, known unknowns. Rose meant that while horror films proffered suspense, in reality, every fan knows the accepted rules of the genre. He argued that, in general, horror movies are actually one of the safest spaces in cinema, since a fan's knowledge of what to expect provides them with a flashlight for the darkest corners a director might lead them to. These claims are untenable with just a glance at the long history of horror, reaching back to Robert Vina's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. Which undermined audience expectations. In 1922, two World War I veterans produced Nosferatu as a reflection of the great dying of the war in which they and their countries had suffered. Rose avoided this history, skipping the silent era in America and Europe, the introduction of supernatural horror to America in the 1930s, and its terrifying revival in the 1960s and 70s. In those decades, films like Hitchcock's Psycho shocked audiences and critics into anger at the director himself. The butchering of Janet Leigh in the shower became the focal point of audience angst. But fans also hated, and loved, the film's weight of dread that suggested you could not trust the director, that he might show you something etched like some cursed rune in your brainstem. George Romero assaulted his audiences with the gore his ghouls consumed, thanks to a Pittsburgh butcher friend who donated the day's leftovers from his shop, and his introduction of a controversial black male lead in the cataclysmic year of 1968. In 1973, documentarian William Friedkin made The Exorcist, a film that triggered such a convulsive reaction that Time magazine spoke to psychiatrists and theologians in an effort to make sense of why theaters in L.A. and New York had to begin running the film as early as 8 a.m. to handle the crowds that stretched around entire city blocks. Rose ignored all this because he had to in order to claim our entrance into an age of post-horror, a phase that obviously suggests something that has come after and replaced horror. The peculiar phrase, peculiar partially because it fails to communicate any meaningful information, is probably borrowed from the overused notion of postmodern. It also performed the job the author wanted it to, in inciting fan outrage and hundreds of thousands of shares and likes, the cryptocurrency of online social capital. We could easily, too easily, write off Rose's post-horror category as a provocative hot take, the current nomenclature for an underdeveloped notion hurled like a hand grenade from the pillbox of a social media platform. But this idea has found wide support, especially among critics who found themselves drawn to the meaning of aesthetic documents that used horror commonplaces to make their point. The term elevated horror began to make the rounds among these critics in 2018. Ugh, I'm not even much of a horror fan, but I can smell the condescension and the dissembling that's baked into this awful phrase, film critic Alonso Duralde told IndieWire. Jordan Peele felt it necessary to tweet simply that Us is a horror movie at the time of its release, possibly just to shut down what he considered a pretty pointless discussion. Influential critic Matt Zoller Seitz noted the obvious. Calling a film elevated horror is a bit like calling a cheeseburger elevated. You'd simply be saying it's a next-level cheeseburger, and if it's delicious, no one will care what adjective you put in front of it. Much of the conversation about post or elevated horror, or other descriptors like art horror and even smart horror, glossed over the issue really being debated. Even unfriendly critics, who probably want to see most horror tossed onto pop culture's trash heap, are attempting, maybe poorly, to articulate the meaning of horror. Ultimately, then, the question has been less about whether horror films are good, and more a question of whether they matter. The aforementioned horror films force us to see that there's always been something deeply political about 20th century horror, all the way back to its roots as a cry of anger and despair in the aftermath of the Great War's savagery. Arguably, the late 1940s and much of the 50s had been one of the most politically charged eras of the horror film. A generation sat through popular Main Street theaters for most of their Saturdays, as flying saucers and mad scientists justified American military might in the face of an outside threat, transformed people of color around the world into monstrous beings and cruel villains, and offered a worldview fraught with paranoia and hair-trigger rage. Perhaps, and I stress perhaps, no deep philosophical questions emerged from Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, or Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And yet both films were a punch in the gut. Jump scares and gore aren't important to either film. Despite its reputation and title, you'll see more viscera in an episode of your favorite TV police procedural than The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What directors, authors, comic artists, and even game designers want is to hit the audience with a cultural roundhouse. There's no way to do that effectively without pushing political buttons to overstimulate the most delicate nerve ending of personal belief, ideology, patriotism, gender roles, and unexamined hatreds. Movies are not alone in having this effect, and so a full examination of how our monsters claw their way towards some of America's deepest assumptions must speak broadly about horror culture. Best-selling novelist Paul Tremblay writes that horror really works only when it pushes and prods at moral boundaries and forces its audience to confront personal and societal taboos. In fact, he suggests that horror films need a progressive vision to really pull us out to sea on a dark tide. An attempt at a conservative horror tale that allows for an unambiguous happy ending fails to horrify the audience. Writer and director Ashlyn Clark doesn't use the phrase elevated horror, but she has suggested that a difference does exist between something being scary and true, lingering horror. The creation of horror depends on upending convention and, she suggests, should punch up against those in power rather than merely making monsters of those at the bottom. Her masterful, thoughtful, and real damn scary 2018 film, The Devil's Doorway, tosses more than a few matches at the incendiary questions of religion, sexual abuse, and misogyny. Rather than creating a possession exorcism tale with a generic setting, she intertwines it with the legacy of Ireland's Magdalen laundries, which imprisoned unwed mothers, the mentally ill, or women who simply did not conform to social expectations. In Clark's film, there are jump scares, the suggestion of possession, and other tricks of the trade that pay homage to the exorcism drama. But the black wave that rolls over us after the credits roll, a feeling akin to grief as well as fear, comes from the complex evils we've encountered, the intractable horrors perpetrated, as Clark notes, by both the church and the state. However, horror can also seem remarkably obtuse in how it attempts to critique or even resonate with the real world's terrors. Award-winning science fiction and fantasy author Sam J. Miller told Wire magazine that the first episode of American Horror Story Cult, which opened with televised footage of Donald Trump and his surprise 2016 election night victory, took a ham-fisted approach to politics, attempting to juice audience reactions by revealing the horror of our moment. So, does horror ask us to stop thinking or to start? Is it inherently political, or simply a set of illusions that has perfected a way to play with our brain chemistry? If it does have politics, are they progressive or reactionary? Is horror a red state, blue state, or the ultimate swing voter genre?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?